Here is a really interesting story about the trade-off between being a seller on a platform and then the power that the platform has itself. So the big news right now is that there are 14,000 Etsy sellers that have gone on strike in response to Etsy, the popular arts and crafts and goods platform, raising its transaction fees from 5% to 6.5%. And this is the second transaction fee hike that Etsy has proposed on its sellers. I think previously it had gone from 2.5% or 3.5% to 5%. And so this second hike has now caused a bunch of sellers on the platform to strike, and which raises a ton of interesting questions. Or talking points at the very least. So the first is that in the prior episode, we talked about the increased salaries that truckers are getting at Walmart. I think they're raising their base salaries to be a logistics driver, a trucker for Walmart, up to between 90,000 and 110,000. So a significant jump there. I think it was about 26% over what it used to be. And I talked a little bit about incidence and the idea in economics that you can raise price, and it's one thing to just look at, okay, prices have gone up, and in the context of the truckers, it's price wages, but it's only one thing to look at the increase in price. You've actually got to look at the impact of that price and who eats the cost of that price to really see the impact of any policy change, when it comes to economics. Here's another example, I think, of that trade-off when it comes to incidence. And so a little bit of background. Etsy is trying to ramp up its marketing and its operation, and it's basically its capabilities so that it can compete a little bit better against Amazon. And in response to trying to be ambitious about the growth of its platform, it's then saying that, okay, it needs to impose a little bit of a transaction fee increase onto its sellers. And that's the power, of course, of the platform. These sellers who, a lot of them make a living on the platform, would they have the access to customers or the access to the base of users that they have access to if it were not for Etsy? And so is the trade-off fair then, that to say, okay, well, then we can increase transaction fees? But then there's also the trade-off, right, which is Etsy is also nothing without these sellers and these merchants on the platform. So that friction there of the platform wanting to grow and then imposing the cost onto its sellers is going to be one that I think is going to be interesting to look at. I've got a gut feeling that they may lose this one in the short term. Etsy, that is. Like the strike, I think, is received enough publicity, and it's a big enough number of sellers that I think, with the increased publicity, I think the number of sellers that are going to strike, I think, is going to increase, and they might lose in the short term. I think over the long term, just in general, things get more expensive. You have that kind of inflationary effect, and the transaction fees probably will go up. I think a lot of the friction too is that there's an inherent value that Etsy brings to the merchant. Right? There are promises that Etsy will make to a merchant to say, okay, well, by listing on our platform versus an eBay or an Amazon, we're going to deliver XYZ as a promise. And there's this natural threshold to where a seller or a merchant is willing to give up a transaction fee. And I think what they're finding is that they've reached that threshold to where maybe 5% is absorbable for most sellers, and you're seeing kind of the elasticity in the marketplace there to where, okay, that's too much. And they're not going to do that. So they're not going to absorb that 6.5% transaction fee. When any decision like this comes across the news, I'll always like to think about the people sitting in the room who are making the decisions at these companies and say, we use the canonical example here, Daggerfinn, of Gillette and some of the advertising that they did around masculinity and toxic masculinity, I think was the advertising campaign that they really went after. And who in that boardroom is making the decision around who are we going to alienate with this decision and who are we going to bring on board? I think a lot of the stuff around social issues over the last 3 years have really shown brands make that calculation around who they want to appeal to and who they're willing to alienate from their customer base. This is an interesting one because you almost feel like because there's a chicken and egg kind of thing here, and the network effects of a platform like this. Are the sellers the one you want to alienate? Are the sellers the one you want to alienate if you're Etsy corporate? Because a lot of the value that Etsy has been able to generate over time has been a function of the kind of sellers that they've been able to attract. And it's an interesting value proposition. Etsy, I think, anybody who's had a wedding or gone to a wedding or had a baby or all those kind of little trinkets that are typically difficult to find in any other context, at least when it comes to the price-driven marketplaces of Amazon and these things. Etsy has an interesting value proposition, but that value proposition is built on these unique skills or these unique attributes of the sellers. And so the idea of imposing their ambitions, the cost of their ambitions as a corporate entity onto the sellers is an interesting one. I would have been very curious to, or at least been a fly on the wall, to hear about those discussions. Or is it just them leveraging the power that they know that they have as a platform and the network effects that they generate and saying, you know what, the sellers they're going to have to eat the cost anyway, because where else are they going to sell their goods in this kind of an ecosystem to where it's it values crafts and handmade things and things are a little bit more niche or just harder to source than say the mass-produced goods on Amazon, for example. So it's an interesting story that's come out. I think we seem to be in this ecosystem of the bigger platforms facing a little bit, and not just platforms, but just bigger companies in general facing a little bit of friction about the way that they've done business. We saw the first Amazon union at the Staten Island facility that they had. You're seeing a lot of friction around Starbucks. There's just this general sentiment right now to where people are questioning capitalism and whether the way we've done capitalism over the last decades is the way that we need to do it going forward. You're seeing a lot of different kind of pressures around ESG and social agendas being a part of the corporate conversation. So this seems just like a natural thing that would have happened. I think knowing the macroeconomic or the macro conditions right now and the sentiment, could Etsy have maybe held off on making an announcement like this, or could they have made a bigger promise beforehand and then done the transaction increase or the transaction fee increase? The calculus there is interesting to think about it. And as business owners or as entrepreneurs or as anybody who runs companies or manages things, that kind of trade-off is one that you've always got to be thinking about and understanding the greater context of the moves that you make, because there's a little bit of a game theory element even with an employer-employee relationship. There's a game theory element with a platform and a seller relationship too. I mean, any kind of two-sided platform, and in this case it would be a three-sided platform, faces sort of interesting dynamics around decision making. So that's the story for today. Etsy sellers are on strike, about 14,000 sellers in response to this transaction fee. Let me know what you think is going to result of this in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you find these kinds of stories about marketing, about business interesting, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel too, and just get the notification once these videos come out.